Fiction almost always centers on humanity in some way, shape, or form. This makes perfect sense, of course. Stories are at their core tools for understanding the human experience. They become empty without characters, without perspectives to follow, emotions to connect to, and choices to agonize over. We gravitate towards characters who reflect us, even in abstract ways, because we are wired to relate. It's comforting to watch a protagonist navigate a world of chaos and emerge victorious. This human-centric approach is especially prevalent in the horror genre, which tends to follow a clear arc. A threat emerges, the characters scramble to survive, and the danger is either defeated or endures as a lingering menace. Horror, for all its chaos and dread, often has a surprisingly rigid structure, particularly in games. Take, for example, the Resident Evil series. You start off weak and afraid, armed with little more than a pistol and a vague sense of direction. As you explore, you collect keys, unlock shortcuts, gather better weapons, and solve puzzles. There's a rhythm to it. Even as you're being stalked by grotesque monsters, there's a sense of progression. Horror becomes something to be navigated, mastered, and ultimately overcome. Crucially, many horror games build their fear on a specific kind of empathy, the fear of the corrupted human. The monsters you fight aren't alien in origin, they're reflections of what we could become. In Resident Evil, the zombies and mutants were once people, victims of a virus or an experiment gone wrong. In Dead Space, the twisted necromorphs are literally reanimated human corpses puppeted into uncanny forms. Even in more fantastical settings, there's often the implication that the horror was once familiar. This makes them more terrifying, not because they're unknowable, but because they're too close to home. It's the uncanny valley, something that was once human but is now clearly not. In other words, most horror leans on recognition. We're afraid because we see ourselves, or what we might become, in the enemy. The implication is that with just a small push, anyone could fall into monstrosity. This proximity to humanity is what gives many horror games their emotional weight. It's not just a simple fear of death or injury, it's a fear of transformation, of losing the parts of ourselves that make us human in the first place. For me personally, one of the few things more terrifying than the corrupted human is an enemy that is fundamentally beyond humanity, something that simply cannot be understood by a rational mind. Something so far removed from human logic or morality that the act of trying to understand it feels like a threat to your sanity. These are not creatures with tragic backstories, they are not the result of twisted experiments gone wrong. These are beings that were never meant to be known, forces that reduce us to ants crawling on a map we can't even read. As a kid, I was obsessed with the work of H.P. Lovecraft, who is the forefather of this genre, which is typically dubbed cosmic horror. I am utterly transfixed by the idea that there might be forces beyond our comprehension, and I'm always on the hunt for media that does a good job depicting this, and that ideally doesn't have an author as morally bankrupt as H.P. Lovecraft. The three pieces of media I'll be discussing in this video, Bloodborne, the Magnus Archives, and House of Leaves, are all the best of the best in this category as far as I'm concerned. They not only evoke the same feeling, but surpass Lovecraft's work in emotional depth and philosophical weight. I revisit each of them constantly, and I highly recommend that you check them out for yourself before watching this video in its entirety. While I'll do my best to keep things digestible for those who have not experienced or do not wish to experience these stories, part of the magic of them is discovering things for yourself, so consider this your invitation to close this video, explore on your own, and then come back. But if you're ready to dive in, let's take a look at what it means when horror stops being about us. From Software's Bloodborne doesn't waste any time letting you know that you are not important. You begin the game in a chair, half dead, as a doctor rants at you about blood administration. A moment later, a werewolf tears you apart, and then you wake up somewhere else, alone, except for a static doll. You weren't chosen. You're not a hero. There's not even a prophecy decreeing that you might do something useful someday, like in the Dark Souls games. You're simply a patient in a clinic where something has clearly gone horribly wrong. At first glance, Bloodborne appears to follow a rather familiar gothic horror setup. There's a cursed town, beasts that roam its streets, and a mysterious healing church behind it all. Your enemies are human, or something resembling human. For the most part, the early game bosses of Bloodborne are former people corrupted by the very same blood that the healing church uses on people. It's a very familiar setup, and this makes it almost comforting. It's just another example of the all-too-common human horror. And then the game does something interesting. It shifts. What began as werewolves and mobs quickly descends into ancient crypts and alien gods. The true horror of Bloodborne isn't the body horror or the violence present in the game. It's the slow realization that everything you understood to be the cause is in fact a mere symptom of a much deeper rot, a cosmic rot. Behind the city, the church, and the hunter's dream lie the Great Ones, vast and incomprehensible entities who exist outside time and human reason. Their motives are unknowable, their presence overwhelming. Some want children, others want contact, but none of them care. Not about you, not about Yharnam, not about anything that could be called human. And yet humanity keeps reaching for them. The scholars at Byrgenwerth tried to ascend to become Great Ones themselves. The Healing Church tried to harness their power to cure mankind. All of them failed, and the consequences for their failure are disastrous. The implication is clear. Trying to understand the cosmos is an act of madness, not because it's inherently evil, but because it's simply too much. Human minds break when asked to process it. Insight, the stat that represents sanity in Bloodborne, literally causes your perception of the world to change. Gain enough, and things you couldn't see before, like the amygdalas clinging to the buildings around you, become terrifyingly visible. They were always there, you just didn't have the eyes to see them. Bloodborne's endings offer no true salvation from the nightmare. The best ending you can hope for is one in which you forget everything that has happened to you and wake up on the Yharnam streets in blissful ignorance. Another ending sees you confined to a wheelchair, nothing more than a puppet to the moon presence, the great one that oversees the hunter's dream. The true ending of the game, meanwhile, sees you defeat the moon presence and usurp its place as overseer, becoming an infant great one in the process. There is no ending that satisfactorily overcomes the horrors, because the horrors fundamentally cannot be overcome. As much as I love Bloodborne, its narrative weight is somewhat limited by the fact that the player character has no personality of their own. This is a necessary consequence of the type of game Bloodborne is, and it's not a complaint by any means. However, I would argue that having more fleshed out characters adds greatly to the potential power of cosmic horror. When you know the passions, fears, and motivations of the characters in the story, anything that happens to them is going to hit harder, and there are few stories with characters more fleshed out than the Magnus Archives. The Magnus Archives is a horror podcast created by Jonathan Sims. It follows a man who is also named Jonathan Sims, John for short, who has recently been promoted to the position of head archivist at the Magnus Institute. The Magnus Institute collects people's statements regarding strange things that have happened to them. Think Twilight Zone in podcast format. On the surface, it's a relatively simple anthology show. Each episode sees John read a new statement and debate its veracity. As the show progresses, though, things begin to unravel. Stories start to connect. Entities from one episode might appear in another. John and his staff begin to be changed by the statements. It quickly becomes apparent that the Institute isn't just collecting statements for the sake of science, it is caught up in a web of paranormality. If Bloodborne depicts what happens when humanity looks too far outward and finds gods, then Magnus Archives is what happens when we look too deeply inward and find ourselves. The first major twist of Magnus is that these statements are not random incidents, but rather manifestations of entities called the Fears. There are 14 fears, and they represent some of the most fundamental terrors of humanity. These are, in no particular order: the buried, fear of small spaces and being trapped; the corruption, fear of disease and revulsion; the dark, fear of... take a wild guess; the desolation, fear of loss and destruction; the end, fear of death and the inevitable ending of all things; the eye, the fear of being watched or exposed; the flesh, fear of knowing that we are nothing more than meat and bone; the hunt, fear of being chased down by predators; the lonely, fear of isolation and disconnection; the slaughter, fear of pure violence; the spiral, fear of madness and deception; the stranger, fear of the unknown and uncanny; the vast, fear of heights and insignificance; and the web, fear of being controlled or manipulated. These fears are at the center of the Magnus Archives, and though they are godlike, they aren't a traditional pantheon. They are repeatedly described as not quite distinct entities, but rather offshoots of some grander being that humans are fundamentally incapable of understanding. My favorite metaphor in the series for the fears comes from the Season 2 finale, when they are first properly introduced.
Imagine you are an ant, and you have never before seen a human. Then, one day, into your colony, a huge fingernail is thrust, scraping and digging. You flee to another entrance, only to be confronted by a staring eye gazing at you. You climb to the top, trying to find escape, and above you can see the vast, dark shadow of a boot falling upon you. Would that ant be able to construct these things into the form of a single human being? Or would it believe itself to be under attack by 3 different, equally terrible but very distinct assailants?
Regardless of their true nature, the fears are in many ways similar to Bloodborne's Great Ones. They are completely uncaring when it comes to humanity and exist on a plane above us. The key difference, in my opinion, is that while the Great Ones are completely alien to the human condition, the fears are the human condition. As H.P. Lovecraft says, the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. The fears are directly fed by our terror, and in this they distinguish themselves from the Great Ones in an awful way. Where the Great Ones depict a universe that couldn't care less about us, the fears depict one that cares all too much. Not as people, or even as living beings, but as batteries of fear. This comes to a head in Season 5, when John unwittingly summons the fears directly into our world. This creates pockets of terror that the fears trap people in so that they can gorge themselves on humanity's fear endlessly. John travels through twisted carnival rides, never-ending skies, meat gardens, and more throughout the season, and the only constant in this new landscape is that nothing makes sense. The world itself has become utterly incomprehensible. Bloodborne and the Magnus archives both show grand pantheons of unknowable entities to drive home their nightmares. But what does horror beyond humanity look like when no such gods exist? What if all that's there is a house? House of Leaves is a 2000 novel by Mark Z. Danielewski that is difficult to describe. It is, at its most basic, the story of a man editing another man's review of a series of videos that seemingly do not exist. These videos center on a man named Will Navidson who, upon moving to a new home with his family on a street called Ash Tree Lane, discovers that the house is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. The problems with the house compound as doors begin to appear out of nowhere. Whereas in traditional horror this would indicate a haunting, or perhaps that the house was built on a burial ground, in this story, the house is completely, terrifyingly empty. The doors open to reveal an absolute nothingness that is equal parts repulsive and enticing. In Bloodborne, we confront unknowable gods. In the Magnus archives, we are pawns in the machinery of fear. But in House of Leaves, the antagonist is absence itself. Absence of logic, absence of comfort, absence of closure. This is horror without catharsis, a story that erodes our understanding of language and form as much as it does our sense of space. Even the text itself becomes a kind of battleground. Footnotes spiral across pages, text flips upside down, paragraphs fracture and fold into each other. Reading House of Leaves becomes a physical experience, one that mirrors the descent into the house's labyrinthine depths. Wrapped around Navidson's videos, referred to as the Navidson Record, is the commentary of an elderly man named Zampano, who has created an entire academic review, complete with sources, citations, and footnotes. Again, keep in mind these videos don't exist, and so this review is confusing at best. Further confusion is added with the remarks of Johnny Truant, the man who has found Zampano's work and taken it upon himself to edit it. Johnny is already somewhat unstable, and this becomes more and more apparent as the book progresses. He is utterly consumed by the Navidson Record, eventually resulting in his life completely falling apart. He goes so far as to travel across the country to the road Navidson's house was ostensibly on, Ash Tree Lane. This is the moment the book ultimately cements that, yes, the house was never real. Johnny writes, quote, "No one here has heard of Zampano. No one here has heard of the Navidsons. I've found no Ash Tree Lane. Months of travel and I've still found no relief." So as far as the narrative is concerned, we can definitively say that the house is not real. However, this disconfirmation is as far as the book goes to provide an explanation for the house. It hints at answers such as the minotaur that may or may not be present in the winding hallways, but it never gives a concrete reason for the house's strange properties. The reader must accept the total lack of an explanation. We are small, the world is big, and sometimes that world just doesn't make sense. So, what do we do in the face of the insignificance all of these stories confront us with? Interestingly, all three stories do offer a solution. In Bloodborne, the NPC you interact with the most throughout your journey is the doll. She helps you level up and is therefore one of the only reasons you are able to beat the game. One of her most interesting lines is as follows.
About the gods and their love. But do the gods love their creations? I am a doll created by you humans. Would you ever think to love me? Of course. I do love you. Isn't that how you've made me?
Setting aside the somewhat troubling implications of the origin of the doll's love, it is evident that she does indeed love the player character. This is also demonstrated in the true ending when she gently looks after your new form as a fledgling Great One. This love is a beacon of hope in an otherwise bleak setting. In the Magnus archives, love plays an even bigger role in the narrative's resolution. After inadvertently starting the apocalypse, John and his partner Martin set out on a journey to undo the damage. This eventually leads to them realizing that, because John is essentially the origin point of the apocalypse, he must be dealt with if they want to properly remove it. Martin refuses to leave his side. Martin therefore has to kill John to stop the nightmare, and in the ultimate act of love, he does so, banishing the fears back to the realm they came from. John and Martin face both their personal fear and the capital F fears with their love for one another, and ultimately emerge victorious. The resolution in House of Leaves is, in many ways, remarkably similar. Davidson loses himself in the maze-like corridors of the house and has no hope of making it out on his own. His partner, Karen, avoids going in after him at first, instead calling his name and hoping he will emerge. When that doesn't happen, Karen steps in. Zampano describes this action better than I could possibly hope to. Whatever ultimately allows Karen to overcome her fears, there's little doubt her love for Davidson is the primary catalyst. Her desire to embrace him, as she has never done before, defeats the memories of that dark well. The most important light Karen carried into that place was the memory of Davidson, and Davidson was no different. In all of these otherwise vastly different stories, the through line is that, though the universe does not care, we do. We love and we are loved in turn. Whether we're confronting Lovecraftian outer gods, manifestations of our own primal fears, or even just the unknown corners of otherwise familiar places, we are supported by people that care about us. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough.